Welcome to Cognitive Dose. We are here, as always, curing blind spots and shattering cognitive bias.
And today, we are looking at something that is practically a religion in Silicon Valley right now.
Exactly. Today, we're dissecting Ryan Holiday's massive bestseller, The Obstacle is the Way. It's a book that basically attempts to take the ancient Greco-Roman philosophy of Stoicism and adapt it for the modern, hyper-competitive world.
Or, it strips classical philosophy of its necessary moral core to justify ruthless individualism, depending on how you look at it.
Well, we're going to get into that because my position, objectively looking at the text and its widespread appeal, is that it successfully provides an empowering, highly practical framework. It translates ancient wisdom into a pragmatic tool for navigating everyday chaos.
Right. And my position is that this translation creates a completely toxic moral vacuum. It relies on terrible science, whitewashes history, and essentially acts as neoliberal conditioning.
Okay, let's start with the core concept so we have a baseline. The book doesn't just tell you to tough it out. It breaks down handling adversity into this very clean, pragmatic triad. You have perception, action, and will.
The holy trinity of hustle culture.
I mean, it's older than that. Perception is about training yourself to see things objectively without panic. Action is directed, persistent effort. And will is the internal endurance we cultivate when we have zero external agency.
Right.
And to understand the mechanics, the book uses the example of a young John D. Rockefeller during the Panic of 1857. This was a catastrophic financial depression. People are losing everything overnight. But Rockefeller consciously chooses to use cognitive reframing. He perceives the market collapse not as a disaster, but as a school of adversity.
A school of adversity. How quaint.
But there's actual neuroscience behind why this works. When you face a threat, your amygdala, the fear center, fires up and causes emotional paralysis. By actively choosing to reframe the event as an opportunity, Rockefeller engages his prefrontal cortex, which handles logic. That biological shift is what allowed him to maintain total sang-froid while everyone else panicked. It's a vital, replicable skill.
I'm going to stop you right there. That biological shift from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex is real, sure, but framing that mechanism as stoicism is a fundamental perversion of what the philosophy actually is.
How is it a perversion, to use a historical example of emotional control?
Because classical stoicism, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, was not a life hack for maintaining your profit margins during a market crash. It was fundamentally anchored in virtue. They believed that wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance were the only true goods. And more importantly, they believed in oikeiosis.
The concept of interconnectedness?
Exactly. A profound duty to the common good of humanity. The text we are examining today takes the psychological technique, the reframing, and completely divorces it from that ethical framework. It repurposes it for Gilded Age greed.
I think that's a bit harsh. It's just showing how to remain unemotional in a crisis.
Now, look at your Rockefeller example. Praising his emotional detachment completely ignores the reality of his monopolistic psychopathy, predatory pricing, literal destruction of thousands of workers' livelihoods. Staying calm while you destroy people isn't stoic virtue, it's corporate ruthlessness.
Well, let's look at the discipline of action, because the ethics of the amoral exemplar is a really interesting tension in the text. I want to focus on the pragmatic action the book highlights, using the story of Samuel Zemurray.
Oh, I was hoping you'd bring up Zemurray.
Look, it's a brilliant illustration of lateral thinking. Zemurray needed to build a bridge across a river in Central America for his fruit business. The corrupt government officials made it legally impossible. So instead of whining, Zemurray has his engineers build 2 long piers reaching out into the river and connects them in the middle with a temporary pontoon. He didn't break the law, but he bypassed the obstruction. It's a masterclass in focusing purely on the mission.
I reject that entirely.
You reject the ingenuity of the pontoon bridge?
I reject the grotesque sanitization of history to sell a self-help concept. Yes, Zemurray was the head of the United Fruit Company. The book praises his clever engineering. Do you know what the book meticulously omits about how he handled his other obstacles?
The text focuses on the bridge.
Historical records document that when the sovereign government of Honduras wouldn't give him favorable tax conditions, he literally used armed mercenaries to orchestrate a violent coup d'etat. And later, he financially backed the propaganda campaign that led to the 1954 CIA-backed coup in Guatemala, plunging the entire region into decades of bloodshed.
I mean, obviously, I don't defend Zemurray's imperialism. Those facts are horrific.
So why use him as an exemplar? When you praise his resilience without acknowledging the imperialist violence, you are teaching a very specific, incredibly dangerous lesson. You are teaching that any ruthless action is justified if it overcomes the obstacle. The philosophy becomes completely unmoored from morality.
But if we require every historical exemplar to have a spotless moral record, we'd have to throw out almost all ancient wisdom. Think about it like a map. If we find a highly accurate map of a mountain pass drawn by a ruthless conqueror, do we refuse to use it to navigate to safety, simply because the cartographer was terrible? Can't we extract the tactical lesson of persistence and discard the unethical application?
A map is an external tool. A philosophy is an internal operating system. It dictates how you process reality and human beings.
It's still a tool for the mind.
If your internal operating system tells you that empathy, labor regulations, and human lives are just obstacles to be crushed by a superior will, the tool itself is corrupted. You aren't just using the map, you are actively adopting the conqueror's mindset.
Okay, but we aren't just talking about conquerors and CEOs. What about people without massive institutional power? The book uses Jackie Robinson to illustrate the discipline of will. As the first black player in Major League Baseball, he faced horrific, systemic racism. And the book frames his supreme endurance, never taking a swing at his abusers, as the ultimate triumph of stoic will. He retained absolute sovereignty over his emotional state.
That framing is precisely where this book exposes its absolute cultural blindness. It is so easy to write from a position of white privilege and demand that victims of systemic racism simply endure abuse to maintain their emotional equilibrium.
He used self-control to dismantle the color barrier. If he had lashed out, the establishment would have weaponized his anger. It was a strategic deployment of...
It is demanding compliance with broken systems. Contrast Robinson with Rosa Parks. Under the logic of this text, a true Stoic in Rosa Parks' position would have rationally concluded that the bus segregation laws were out of her control, cognitively reframed the situation, and given up her seat to maintain her inner peace.
I don't think the book is saying you shouldn't fight for justice. It's offering a psychological survival mechanism for individuals facing insurmountable odds. It prevents them from being consumed by destructive anger.
No, it shifts the burden of massive systemic failures entirely onto the individual. Sociologists have pointed out that this modern Burrow Stoicism only really applies to a weird demographic, Western-educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
It has millions of everyday readers, though. Sure. And it conditions them to accept the status quo. It tells everyday people that if poverty, algorithmic bias, or a broken healthcare system are crushing them, those are just obstacles to be internally reframed as opportunities. Society is completely absolved of its duty to fix structural inequality. It robs citizens of the ability to engage in active disruptive resistance. I think we need to look at the actual science behind cognitive reframing before we dismiss it entirely as its neoliberal conditioning. Does the mindset work? Let's look at the empirical reality of resilience.
There is no empirical rigor here. The book operates in a complete epistemological void.
That's a huge claim.
It's factually accurate. The entire premise rests on survivorship bias and the narrative fallacy. The author curates a list of historical anomalies: Thomas Edison, Steve Jobs, Amelia Earhart. He implies a direct causal link. Adopt this mindset and you'll triumph.
Well, they did triumph, and they did use these mindsets.
That is survivorship bias. We are only looking at the winners. The book ignores the massive graveyard of millions of people who had the exact same stoic mindset, who worked just as hard, reframed perfectly, and were still fundamentally crushed by poverty, disease, or bad luck.
Yes, the narrative fallacy is a deep-seated human tendency. We want to believe A led to B because randomness is terrifying. But that doesn't mean the mindset is useless.
It means it's unscientific. And the real-world application of this pseudoscience is actually dangerous. Look at the U.S. military's Comprehensive Soldier Fitness Program.
The CSF program, right, which was designed to inoculate soldiers against PTSD using positive psychology and Stoic resilience frameworks, to view combat trauma as an opportunity for post-traumatic growth.
And independent scientific reviews of that program have been devastating. It was rolled out without rigorous randomized controlled trials. Clinical psychologists pointed out that forcefully reframing trauma actively masked deep psychological issues.
They were trying to give soldiers a tool to cope.
If you tell a soldier their trauma is actually an opportunity, you are suppressing valid emotional signals of distress. You decrease the likelihood they'll seek psychiatric help because they feel that struggling means they just aren't mentally tough enough. This framework lacks efficacy and is clinically ruinous.
I acknowledge the limitations, but
It's not a limitation.
it's a fatal flaw. The field of positive psychology is facing a massive replication crisis right now. I know that. Many willpower studies aren't holding up, but the phenomenon of post-traumatic growth is documented in psychological literature. Even if resilience isn't a magical guarantee, isn't the active attempt to reframe an obstacle inherently better for human functioning than surrendering to learned helplessness?
Better for whom? Because treating the brain like a muscle that just needs to withstand pain leads individuals to repeatedly hurl themselves against unyielding structural obstacles. The result is severe burnout and clinical depression.
But if you tell people their outcomes are entirely dictated by macroeconomics and systemic barriers, you strip them of all motivation. The triad of perception, action, and will is a powerful heuristic. When a student fails an exam, choosing to perceive it as an opportunity escapes that amygdala hijack.
Acknowledging a systemic reality does not lead to learned helplessness. Acknowledging that an obstacle is unfair and insurmountable by an individual is the very first step toward collective action.
Look, I think we have to summarize where we stand here. From my perspective, while the historical examples may be sanitized, and while it might sidestep some complexities of empirical psychology, the underlying framework remains incredibly valuable. It offers people a pragmatic way to reclaim their agency. We have to acknowledge that humans possess a remarkable capacity for endurance.
I'm not going to validate that. Endurance devoid of ethics is just sophisticated ruthlessness.
I mean, surely we can find convergence on the idea that human endurance itself is a real biological fact. The question is just how we channel it.
No, I reject that framing completely, because when you strip away the empirical science and the reality of systemic injustice, you aren't offering a tool for endurance. You're peddling a hyper-individualized placebo that protects the powerful.
I don't know if we can reconcile those two views, honestly. If you won't even concede that personal resilience has a place,
It doesn't have a place when it's used as a weapon against the marginalized. Use this knowledge to build your actual mental immunity against superficial wisdom. Subscribe to Cognitive Dose.